So thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. My name's Tom Keating. I'm director here at RUSI of the Centre for Finance and Security. And it is a great pleasure to hold the event this afternoon because it represents culmination of an awful lot of work by Catherine, who made some analogy with pregnancy this morning when talking about how hard this paper had been to bring to fruition. So we'll hear more about that from Catherine in a second. But the reason that we thought the paper was important, or the reason that Catherine thought the paper was important to produce, is that certainly the kind of hypothesis is that Chinese money laundering organizations have become one of the preeminent global money laundering threats, and that's obviously a topic that we study in detail here at RUSI. And we'll talk about the techniques and so on that they use, but it's a classic example, I would suggest, of kind of old meets new and causing us a lot of trouble. So let's leave it like that. But we're talking about multi-billion-dollar operations. We're talking about kind of the efficiency that those that are trying to launder the proceeds of crime are looking for. So the paper then kind of looks at these issues, queries kind of why these Chinese money laundering organizations have become so successful, and I think critically queries whether this threat poses what is universally known as a state threat, and we'll get into that in the conversation. The paper was supported by the SOCACE research program, which is funded by the FCDO, the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So the plan for the next hour or so is that I will shortly pass the podium to Heather Marquette, Professor Heather Marquette from Birmingham University, who leads the SOCACE program and is a pillar of support for this kind of research. Heather, thank you as ever. We'll then turn to Catherine, who will say a kind of few words about the paper, the findings, and what she thinks is important about it. Then we'll have a conversation with our panelists, about more of whom in a second, and then the aforementioned networking drinks upstairs. To make life easy for me, there is a QR code up here. If you want to ask questions, it works. We checked it. Ewan, thank you very much for asking a question already. Please use the QR code to ask your questions, and I'll try and aggregate those up here on the iPad and ask them in some form of structure and order. So, look at that. All the cameras pointing at the screen, not at me. Excellent. So with that, Heather, I'll pass the floor to you while people slide away, and thank you again all for coming this afternoon.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to everybody who's joining us tonight. As Tom mentioned, my name's Professor Heather Marquette. I'm a professor at the University of Birmingham in the School of Government, and I'm the director of SOCACE, so the Serious Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Program. As he mentioned, we're funded by FCDO's Research and Evidence Directorate as an independent external research program, producing research that provides a global public good available to everybody. We work with a number of research teams here in the UK and around the world, including the CFS team here at RUSI. I think I can't really overstate just how important it is to have this commitment to independent research funding that allows researchers to follow the evidence wherever it seems to take us and whatever it might be telling us, in a way that provides insights for policy and practitioners that is available for everybody to read, to use in their own work, and to challenge if they like to. And I really wanted to say thank you for RED, Research and Evidence Directorate, for their support, as always, with this. I won't take up any more time, having been here along the way with Catherine. I'm looking at this research and being very excited about it coming out. I also don't want to preempt what she and the fantastic panel will say, but I do want to say thank you to Catherine for all of her great work, her hard work, her responsiveness to my comments and et cetera as well, and just to the CFS team as a whole. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Brilliant. Heather, thank you very much indeed. So we'll hear from a second from Catherine, but we're also delighted this afternoon to be welcomed by Phil Brickell, MP, who is chair of the APPG on anti-corruption, down the road, and also often on the other side of the table in the Foreign Affairs Committee, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, when we get asked to give evidence. Phil, thank you very much for making time this afternoon. And then Adrian Searle, who is a Senior Associate Fellow of our programme here at RUSI and formerly Director of the National Economic Crime Centre on the other side of the river at the National Crime Agency. So we'll hear their reflections in due course. But first, I'll ask Catherine to kick us off with an overview of the paper. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Heather, for that introduction, and to the SOCACE team, the whole team, for the support during the research. It was invaluable. I did indeed describe this as like having a second child, except it's been a much longer gestation than my pregnancy was, thankfully, but equally painful at times. But I'm very pleased that the research is out there, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Yeah, the genesis of this project was very much RUSI's work on state threats. We established a couple of years ago a state threats task force, and it draws very heavily on the research of our other senior associate fellow, Matthew Redhead. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with his work on state threats. So he published a long paper on the topic earlier this year, and there's a synthesis paper recently published on China in the state threats context. I will say there are a few postcards around the place with the QR codes that take you to either my paper or Matthew's papers, so do look at those. They're definitely worth a read. You know, one of the aspects of his research looks at the role of non-state actors and the nexus with state threats, recognizing that states are both increasingly outsourcing activity to non-state actors, such as organized crime groups and money laundering organizations, potentially, we'll talk about today, but also importantly that sometimes activities that are taken or that are undertaken by state-linked non-state actors are not always state-directed. And I apologize for the number of state hyphens within that sentence, but hopefully you understand what I mean, because I think that tension is really at the heart of the research, and we'll go on, I think, to talk a little bit about the kind of state threats lens application. So turning to this research in particular, Tom mentioned in his introduction, the threat of Chinese money laundering organizations has been recognized globally. The last US National Risk Assessment identified that Chinese money laundering organizations are one of the key actors laundering money professionally in the United States and around the globe. I'm sure many of us will be familiar with the discourse in the US and Canada on the topic of Chinese money laundering organizations, whether that's the Cullen Commission in Canada a few years ago that reported on the links between Chinese organized crime and the gambling industry, whether that's the Senate hearings that I'm sure we've seen from the US, whether that's documentaries on the FT website about the intersection between Chinese money laundering organization and Mexican cartels. And so this research really looks at some of the growth of that activity and the drives of activity in a US and Canadian context, but also seeks to understand that in a UK and European context, and what is the same, what is different, and how does that impact our response. And I think given that the focus here today is thinking very much in the UK context, so what does that mean for the UK in terms of its resilience? I'm just going to start very briefly by trying to summarize for those who aren't familiar with the way that Chinese money laundering organizations work. Very, very simple process. It is far more complicated and more nuanced and complex than this, but just to understand some of the basic principles, because they are, I think, directly relevant to some of the questions about whether this is a state threat. And I will say that the introduction section of the paper, with various definitions and different arguments about different definitions and what constitutes underground banking and what doesn't, was by far and away the hardest part of the paper to draft. So I will do my best to summarize it very quickly. At a very basic level then, and this is so very simple, and using the UK as an example. So you have an organized crime group here in the UK that has a lot of cash. It decides to outsource the laundering of that cash. Generally, but not exclusively, we're talking about drugs here, but obviously there are other cash-generating activities, but generally we're talking about drugs here. Chinese money laundering organization will collect that cash and then generally use a network of money mules to deposit that cash in small amounts into bank accounts. For practice, I'm sure many of us are familiar with this idea of sort of smurfing into multiple bank accounts. These money mules are often drawn from the Chinese diaspora, often students. It's often categorized, particularly in the UK, as a student issue, but it's not exclusively students that are used. And then this is the really kind of crucial part when you're looking at the operation of Chinese money laundering organizations, is that the Chinese money laundering organization, which then has that cash under their control in a bank account, will offer to sell that British currency to Chinese nationals, charging them a commission to buy it. And this is the really crucial part, because one of the reasons for the success of Chinese money laundering organizations is that there are many wealthy individuals in China who want to move some of their money out of the country, and whether that's to invest in property, whether that's to pay school fees, university fees. And China has strict capital controls. You can't just transfer as much money as you want out of China. You can't just buy a property abroad. So these individuals, they want access to Western currency, whether that's pounds, euros, dollars, and they're prepared to pay for it. And a lot of the time, it might be legitimate income that they've derived from China that they want to move out of the country. But the lack of a formal and official routes to do this means that there's a thriving market for the informal value transfer services that Chinese money laundering organizations offer. So to complete the sort of cycle, in China, the individuals who have purchased the British currency will make an equivalent payment in Chinese currency to a bank account controlled by the Chinese money laundering organization or one of its associates in China. And the Chinese money laundering organization will make an equivalent value minus any fee available back to the organized crime group. They can then spend it however they want to pay suppliers, to invest in more product, to expand their business, or just to engage in the typical kind of lavish spending that we know criminals like. This is a really simplified version, and it soon gets more complicated when you draw in elements of crypto, trade-based money laundering, the purchase of luxury goods, netting off of all the various transactions taking place. It soon becomes very complicated, but I think it's important just to understand this basics, because it's key to the success of Chinese money laundering organizations and the way in which they operate, the fact that they have this supply and demand on both sides, which they're able to service. And I just want to summarize quickly just a couple of key points then from the research before we get into the discussion, and we'll touch on these points a lot more, I think. The first is this business model is really successful. It has proved incredibly successful and profitable, both for the Chinese money laundering organizations, but also the organized crime groups who are seeking to use these services. At the same time, we've also seen the demand for professional money laundering services grow. And there is a really symbiotic relationship here as Chinese money laundering organizations become more effective, providing fast, efficient, quick ways to move money for criminals. It allows criminals to either retain more of the profit, invest, expand. So this, I was going to say a virtuous cycle, but that's absolutely not what I mean, where the growth of the money laundering organizations also allows the organized crime groups to grow their own revenue at the same time. I think the other key element we've touched on is the central role of the Chinese diaspora here. And that is really important for a number of reasons. First, because Chinese students, Chinese individuals in low-paid roles are often recruited as money mules, an essential part of the process. It also means that you've got that demand from the Chinese communities, whether in the UK, the US, and their families for access to currency. But it also creates this really strong kind of cultural family ties that make it very hard from a law enforcement perspective to kind of penetrate. And then finally, just touching on the state threats question, which we'll come back to. It's worth stating up front, I think, that there is no public evidence that I could find that shows that the Chinese state is directing or controlling the activities of these organizations. Even if you look at some of the material from the US and Senate hearings, that's confirmed on the record. There's no public evidence to suggest this. And indeed, the capital flight that's occurring from China because of this is significant and impacting an economy that is struggling. So you wonder why it appears that there is at least some sort of tacit acceptance by China of the way in which these organizations are operating, and question whether there is some kind of mutually beneficial relationship when it feels like there is an incentive for China to collaborate with law enforcement authorities in the West to really tackle this threat. I think it's a really interesting and nuanced question, which I think picks up some of the difficulties when we're talking about state threats more broadly, but I think hopefully we'll get into as part of the discussion on the panel. And I will pause there, having taken more than my allotted 5 minutes, but hopefully that's a useful introduction.
It says 7 on my sheet. So
7, oh fine, I'm all good then.
You're absolutely... So I just need to pick you up on the title of the paper. So do you want to explain the flying money reference, please? please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say thank you, ChatGPT, for the title. I have a long list of catchy suggestions for the title. So flying money is an English translation of the Chinese term around for this kind of informal value transfer system, the underground banking system. So it's often called flying money because the way that money moves across borders without the actual cash moving part. So it's the English translation of the Chinese term, and then we just played around, myself and ChatGPT played around with how to turn that into a suitably appropriate title for the paper.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's turn to a bit of conversation. Adrian, I come first to you. I mean, a kind of headline question given your background. Like, how did you see this challenge? Is it as big as I stated in the opening remarks, Catherine stated? What's the significance from a UK perspective?
I mean, in a word, it's very significant. The National Crime Agency produces an annual assessment where it sets out the threat of serious organised crime. And in the latest assessment, it says in the paperwork that it's highly likely offenders linked to China pose the biggest non-British serious organised crime threat to the UK. And it goes on to talk about Chinese linked individuals being involved in basically the full range of crime types, from illicit finance, fraud, drugs, through to organised immigration crime, money trafficking, etc. So we see Chinese linked individuals involved in all those crimes at scale. See, at the heart of all those crimes is money, as Catherine was setting out. So
we have a mic failure. Can you use this?
so I don't know how much of that you heard, but
It was rubbish,
you did
don't worry.
hear it.
Carry on.
I'm getting thumbs up at the back, so hopefully most of you heard that, so I won't repeat it. But yeah, as we're saying, Chinese linked individuals are very central to the crime threat in the UK. Money is in turn central to that, and the money laundering as a service, which Catherine was talking about, is key. Again, as Catherine set out, we've seen this evolution of the threat over many years, from initially this ability to help Chinese nationals avoid the foreign exchange controls, through to, well, if you're doing that, why don't you help some of the other criminal groups in the UK move some of their funds? We've then seen the explosion in the US linked to the fentanyl trade of money laundering capabilities. And then, I know it's not really touched on in the paper, but it is worth saying that the scam centers we've seen operating out of Southeast Asia, Chinese individuals very central to those, and they've been further developing their ability to move vast sums of money at pace and scale across the globe. So all of these capabilities are being harnessed and used by criminal groups in the UK and beyond. And it's a separate part of the NCA's assessment, but criminal groups increasingly are very fluid in nature. They work in partnership with other groups. And so, for sure, Chinese linked individuals are very central to that activity. When I was in the NEC, being quite sort of simple in my way of thinking, I evolved a way of describing the money laundering problem, the global money laundering problem, as a Western and an Eastern sort of route to money laundering. So we had a particular focus for some time on what I would call the Western route. So this was Russian-linked organised crime groups, money launderers, who were, again, providing money laundering as a service. And the NCA carried out Operation Destabilize last year, which many of you will have heard about. And in very simple terms, in many ways similar to what Catherine was describing for the Chinese money laundering, we had Russian money launderers providing a service, an intermediary service between cash-rich drugs groups in the UK, crypto-rich ransomware gangs in Russia, and the need to sort of settle between those two groups using sort of shadow banking facilities in the Middle East, which then enabled ultimately the purchase of the drugs back in South America. So that was sort of the Western route, and we hit it quite hard through Destabilize. There's ongoing work to do, but I think we have had an impact on it. That, unfortunately, does have the knock-on consequence, though, of displacement. And if we already saw we had a problem with the Eastern route, as pretty much described by Catherine, I suspect our impact on the Russian money laundering groups has probably shoved even more of the money laundering activity towards the Chinese laundering groups. Again, sort of reflecting a little bit on what Catherine has said, the reason this is so challenging for us in the UK and elsewhere is the reasons that Catherine set out around the Chinese diaspora, the challenges there are for law enforcement engaging with the Chinese community. But also the global nature of this makes it very challenging. Trade-based money laundering is one of the key component parts, and this is something UK law enforcement, but you could argue globally, law enforcement has struggled with, the complexity of some of the elements of trade-based money laundering. In particular, the sort of interchange between legitimate and illegitimate businesses and how they operate is quite hard to sort of untangle all of that. I do wonder, and it doesn't really get much reference in the paper, I do wonder also the sort of intersection that there probably is, but there's more research required with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the intersection between some of the organised crime groups who are involved in elements of that, and some of those in turn do have links into the state. This sort of global industry, some of it legitimate, some of it illegitimate, is really hard to untangle, which is why I think Chinese money laundering is particularly difficult for us. Additionally, you've obviously got China in the middle of it, and as we'll come on to later, there are some difficulties engaging with Chinese counterparts. And then lastly, I just touch on the UK's own vulnerabilities. Chinese money laundering groups have been very good at exploiting the weaknesses we have in our own anti-money laundering system, whether it's the sort of well-known weaknesses in Companies House registration, the challenges around, for example, the real estate sector, and I've probably touched lastly on cash-based money laundering more generally. It's something we've struggled with, and that all being said, and we may come on to this again in the conversation, a lot of changes are underway and are making a difference. And perhaps we can talk about that a bit more as the conversation goes on.
So I'm going to come to Phil in a second, because I know you're a dedicated watcher of UK vulnerabilities. But just before we do, when we first started the program here at RUSI in 2014, everyone from the NCA was running around talking about controllers in Dubai and places like that. So at what point, I mean, I was obviously asleep, but at what point did China suddenly kind of become this dominant force in the way that, I mean, what happened that meant, because there have always been Chinese students in the UK, I mean, what changed in the environment that went from, we were basically dedicatedly focusing on the Middle East, or UAE in particular, to this recognition that the CMLOs are the operators to beat?
I should say that the Middle East element of the global money laundering problem hasn't gone away, so it's still very much a focus. In terms of the sort of shift, in terms of the scale of the threat, there's a number of elements to it, I think. And I should say the NCA called out this issue back in 2019. So, we've been very aware. I say we. I keep saying we. My former organisation are very aware and have been very aware of the challenge for some time. I think some changes that happened in China itself and the rules over foreign exchange controls, they changed in 2016, 2017, and I think that then had a knock-on effect, which drove some of this. But also, I think that as I was just describing, this increasing fluidity in the organised crime landscape and the greater willingness of organised crime groups to work with each other, that's coincided with the Chinese themselves getting far better at money laundering. So I think there's a number of factors.
Okay. Phil, I gave you a 30-second warning there. So what of what Adrian says would you translate then into the vulnerabilities that we have in the UK? What should we be doing to close down the vulnerabilities that you would identify?
Well, I think I fundamentally agree with quite a lot of what Adrian said there. The fact of the matter is that the vulnerability principally is about how professional money laundering networks can thrive because they offer cheap, fast, informal value transfer that exploits gaps in regulation, in the supervisory framework, and weak transparency and limited enforcement capacity. So some of those gaps, just to speak to them in a little bit of detail, and then what we should do about them. The fact that we still don't have fully verified beneficial ownership and corporate registration data through Companies House is a weakness that we see time and time again raising its head. Now, there has been demonstrable progress on this off the back of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. We know that Companies House is moving, having increased registration fees to implement verification, but it's something that I think is a weakness in the system that we're seeing not just professional money laundering organisations exploit, but comes up time and time again. Another one that I know is close to my predecessor's heart as the chair of the all-party parliamentary group, Joe Powell, who's the MP for Kensington and Bayswater, that he talks about time and time again, and Adrian alluded to it, is the fragmented trust and property data that we have, which allows for asset concealment. And it's worth dwelling on a really interesting statistic that the all-party parliamentary group has researched and come to the bottom of, which is that 45% of UK property owned by foreign entities remains hidden behind opaque structures, whether that's offshore trusts or whether that's other shell company structures that conceal ownership. And also, I think the fact, and we've seen this come into sharp relief in the last few days with the Bitcoin Queen news item of the 5.5 billion Bitcoin that was embezzled, that increasingly the way that crypto is being used alongside more traditional sort of trade-based money laundering as a vehicle to evade scrutiny, try and evade law enforcement, and try and exploit weaknesses. So fundamentally, what I think we do need to see is, frankly, better resourced analytical and enforcement capacity. That's not just in the UK FRU, but also across the law enforcement landscape. The all-party parliamentary group, which I chair, has been pushing for, Catherine, a virtuous circle of agency funding through an economic crime fighting fund. That would mean repurposing seized criminal assets to make sure that more of them are hypothecated to give our law enforcement agencies a more durable, sustainable, and importantly, predictable financial backing to take the fight to organised crime gangs and professional money launderers. That unfortunately didn't make progress in the Commons, but I am working on a cross-party basis with peers in the upper chamber to see if we can move that forward through the government's crime and policing bill. But of course also, we touched on enablers, professional enablers, whether that's corporate service providers, lawyers or accountants, who are not always held to sufficiently strict account. And what I would say, I would commend the government on consolidating the supervisory regime in the regulated sector, bringing 22, 23 odd supervisory bodies for money laundering supervision together so that there is consistency in the application of the anti-money laundering framework, because we all know that if you are an organised crime gang, you're going to exploit the weakest point in the supervisory framework. And the all-party group is pushing for the regulated perimeter to be extended to include vulnerabilities in the UK economy, including universities and schools. So we know that there's some weaknesses there. The all-party group has had a number of recommendations that have been around for quite some time, including through its 2 economic crime manifestos, but also its landmark Clean Foundations for Growth report that was published earlier this year, which touches on some of these points, but also is calling on greater transparency in the UK overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, including around publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership, registers which aren't just open, but which are machine readable and API accessible to lower compliance costs and to improve access, and also making sure that the FRU and enforcement agencies are properly resourced and have some of the capacity to work more collaboratively with Chinese counterparts. All too often, actually, when I talk about money laundering and the threat, actually China doesn't come up. It's quite strange in a way that you said it's the most significant nationality in terms of its presence, but all too often we don't actually talk about that eastern route as you characterised it, Adrian. So really interesting to hear that, and I think that must redouble our thoughts within Parliament as to how this manifests itself.
Great. We'll come to the sort of state dimension, both positive and negative to this in a second, but I just want to come back to kind of the key characteristics, Catherine, to you, that make these schemes so successful. And I'm particularly interested in the importance of students in all of this and the money mules, because that seems like a significant vulnerability, which I'm sitting here thinking there must be something we can do. So characteristics, and are there some obvious steps we can take that build on the kind of landscape that Phil just painted?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's right to highlight the number of vulnerabilities. I would add to the list of vulnerabilities the sort of well-known, and Adrian sort of touched on it, but things like cash deposits at the post office, which have been a big area of focus, but continue to be a route that is exploited. And if you look at some of the arrests and prosecutions of students who are acting as money mules, they are quite often depositing money into post office branches. So I would add that very much to the list of vulnerabilities that are being exploited. We touched on sort of some of the characteristics, but I would say, and to echo Phil's comment, these money laundering organizations, they have expanded really quickly, and particularly what we've seen in the US is that they've been able to undercut the competition quite substantially, charging a much lower rate of commission, and that's really part of their business model. And we talked, Adrian mentioned sort of destabilize, and destabilize, we've got some interesting data around the kind of the commission that Russian money laundering networks were charging, sort of 3-5% around that. Chinese money laundering networks will charge 1-2% commission. They will carry out money laundering services for free as a kind of loss leader, because actually they make the money, and that's why it's important, I think, why I spent some time at the beginning talking about the capital flight element of it, because they make their money on the kind of Chinese side of the transactions. The money laundering is just, gives them the access to the cash, so they don't need to charge the high level of commission. And I think that's really important, and that's really an important part of how they've developed. And in addition to low fees that they charge, I think one of the characteristics is that they operate really quickly. So rather than having to wait weeks for laundered funds, if you're an organized crime group, you get it in a few hours. Often Chinese money laundering networks will give a money back guarantee as well. So if something happens, you still get your money back. Great selling point compared to some of the other professional money laundering networks. Also, another point that came up a lot is that compared to some other money laundering organized criminal networks, relatively not violent. So you're less likely to be shot or by a Chinese money laundering network than, say, another network. And that kind of professionalism that they've brought to the operation has made them a really appealing partner for many organized crime groups. There's also evidence, I think, that they have a higher risk appetite as well. So Adrian mentioned the 2019 NCA advisory on money laundering networks, and that talked about how Chinese cash couriers, when they get intercepted, they tend to have a much higher volume of cash on them than the equivalent cash courier networks operating in Hawala or Pakistani networks. So they appeared to have a much higher risk appetite for moving large amounts of money. And if you are an organized crime group with a large amount of money to move, that's really appealing, particularly if, as I said, they're doing it quickly, efficiently with a money back guarantee. Coming to the point on students, I think the other important thing to note is the use of encrypted communications to manage these networks, whether it's to recruit money mules, whether it's to buy, sell currency. So generally using WeChat, the Chinese messaging service, and that's a core platform by which the Chinese money laundering organizations run these. I think the student point is really interesting, and I think certainly in the UK it's often been characterized as a student threat. And I've spoken to people from various different sort of backgrounds whose response to the overall threat of Chinese money laundering organizations is to say, well, we'll do some awareness raising in university, and then we'll have solved the problem. Which is, I think a little naive as to how sophisticated and complex these are. And I do also, wonder if sometimes the way that it's being conceptualized in the UK as a student problem, it's, if we tackle students, we've sorted it, actually undermines the importance and the severity of the threat. Chinese students play a significant role, and I've heard some really substantial estimates of the number of Chinese students who are engaged in money laundering activities, and also some really sort of awful stories about vulnerable Chinese students who are exploited by organized crime groups as well. There's clearly a key issue and a vulnerability there, but I don't think that just tackling it from students, just raising awareness in universities, just asking banks to do more around opening accounts and monitoring accounts for students is going to tackle the problem, because these groups are so sophisticated that they will just move to another route. I think the final sort of characteristic I would point out, and sort of Adrian's touched on this a little bit already, is how we've seen the Chinese money laundering networks, particularly in the UK and Europe, working alongside other types of organized crime groups. So there was a case, I think in Spain, where you had an Albanian Hawala network that also involved individuals linked to Chinese money laundering organizations working together. And I think that's a really interesting distinction between the experience in the UK and Europe to the example in the US, where certainly from a money laundering side, the Chinese money laundering networks kind of really took over and moved the cartels out of the business. They obviously engage a lot with the cartels on the sort of drug supply, but it's a slightly different dynamic. And certainly talking to a number of people in the UK and Europe, they don't see that the Chinese money laundering networks dominate to the extent that we see in the US. And actually, there's some interesting different dynamics about why different organized crime groups, depending on where they're located, depending on the type of crime they're engaged in, why they might choose different types of professional money laundering services, and kind of how the market dynamics in the UK, at least, are slightly different to what we've seen in the US as well. But it's clear that these groups are becoming increasingly embedded within the organised crime landscape, and there's real examples of them collaborating with other networks as well.
So there's, and just a reminder, if you want to ask questions, please do use the QR code. A number of you are doing just that. Just to stay with that for a second, there is a suggestion, as opposed to a question, but suggestions are also helpful, around, so just to pull on the student thread a bit more, noting the potentially simplistic way of thinking about it, which is a summary of what you just said. But to what extent would it help if banks were closing accounts are there kind of legacy accounts which get taken over after students leave the UK or after they leave university? Is there something in there about kind of better information to the banks, which means that they can at least shut down the possibility of these being further used?
Yeah, I feel Adrian's itching to come in.
Go on, Adrian, go.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very aware of the challenge for a while, so there has been quite a lot of work undertaken. Some of that has been in the prevent, as we would call it, space, where there has been advice given out to Chinese students, warning them of the risk of being ensnared in these money laundering networks. As Catherine was intimating, that does put some off, others it doesn't. We've also worked very closely, as you're sort of touching on, Tom, with the banks. They're very aware of as we call it, the typology, and so their sort of transaction monitoring regimes, etc., looking very carefully at this sort of thing. Yes, there are weaknesses related to controls in post offices, and as more bank branches close down and more people are paying in, depositing money via the post offices, this is a problem. That being said, it's been one of the key things that the National Economic Crime Centre's been doing for some time, is bringing together the various parties in a sort of convening function. So the banks, the post office itself, the regulators, to try and work through changes in the control environment that can help mitigate the risk. And there has been some success, albeit there's still vulnerabilities there that are being exploited. So action is being taken. I would sort of pick up, if I may, Phil, on your point about the sort of priority that law enforcement's given to this problem. It has recognised it as a very significant problem. There are folk in the room here today who, their core job is leading the work against Chinese money laundering. The NEC, with partners in the banking sector in particular, issued some priorities for the whole system relatively recently, and amongst those priorities, China was called out as a focus. So, there is work afoot, but it is a very complex problem that's going to take a lot of different things to come together for us to overcome it.
I want to come to solutions in a second, and I'll come, Phil, to you in a moment. But I just want to kind of deal with the point that you repeatedly remind us of, Catherine, when we're talking about this upstairs, and you've mentioned it once here already. Just to drill in a bit more to the link or otherwise between the Chinese state. I should say, by the way, that for the first time ever, visitors from China to our section of the RUSI website was third this month, I think, because of this event. So they're obviously paying attention over in China. But just unpack that a bit, because I'm sitting here going, yeah, come on. I mean, that country can do anything, anywhere, and there's everything that's going on the planet. Yet, you say that this is something that it's not complicit in, or...
What I say is that there's no public evidence that the Chinese state is directing these money laundering organizations to act in the way that they have. When you look at the rhetoric around this threat in the US, it's very much framed as a state threat. And the language talks about being at war with the CCP on the issue around kind of Chinese money laundering. It's very much kind of seen from that perspective. Certainly, I think the European perspective, and speaking to experts in Europe on the topic as well, have a more nuanced, I think, appreciation of it, and were less inclined to see the activities of Chinese money laundering organizations as distinct from Chinese organized crime groups, through that lens. There is evidence, and we've seen that in Canada and other places, that Chinese money laundering schemes do also involve members of the CCP, Chinese government officials availing themselves of these schemes to move money around, move money out of the country. But that does not mean that the state is directing, and I think we also need to be careful about assuming that the Chinese state is one organ that thinks with one mind, because actually that is not reflective, and we are very much at danger of always imposing our sort of Western biases on the way that we think a state operates, which may not hold true in the case of China. And the fact that party officials might be involved in money laundering organizations does not necessarily make it a state threat. And when you look at, to go back to Matthew Redhead's paper, his definition of state threats, which we've used as a basis in the paper, needs that demonstrable evidence of the engagement or encouragement of a state actor, and that evidence just is not there, certainly not in the public domain. Which lends itself very much, I think, to the question then of cooperation. We talked a little bit around that already. And if we accept the premise that the Chinese state is not directing this activity, does that mean that there is the opportunity to engage with them in some way? And there have been various efforts at a diplomatic level. We've seen some cooperation. So interesting, Phil, you mentioned the kind of Bitcoin queen, and it was really interesting. I think it was when the assets were seized, or when the prosecution was, there was a really clear statement from the Met Police in relation to that case, where they praised the cooperation with the Chinese authorities that they had in a really kind of clear way that I'd not really seen before. But it's clear that there is evidence on some matters where we are getting some collaboration with the Chinese authorities. So does this become an area where, given the impact on China, they can, there is scope for that kind of discussion as to steps that both countries could take to try and mitigate the threat?
So an opportunity for common cause. Phil, you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. You scrutinise what the government is doing as relates to foreign affairs. What's your sense of the possibility of cooperation with China on this issue?
Well, I think there is, and it's reassuring to hear your comments there, Catherine, about the Bitcoin Queen case and the operational willingness in some instances for Chinese state authorities to assist. I think the fundamental point that we need to remember, of course, is what is the driver behind a lot of these behaviours, and that's not going away anytime soon. That fundamentally, what originally drove all this was strict capital controls in terms of capital outflows from China, and unless anyone tells me otherwise, I don't think the Chinese government's going to lift those anytime soon. So in essence, the threat, the underlying core issue is not going to change in terms of what's driving a lot of this behaviour. But I think there is an opportunity to work on potential further intelligence sharing. I think there is an opportunity as well on mutual legal assistance. There, of course, is going to be an international countering illicit finances summit, which will be taking place here in the UK next year, which gives the UK government an opportunity to convene like-minded nations and drive some meaningful global leadership with like-minded states that want to address these issues. China has skin in the game here. Again, I'll go back to the Bitcoin Queen case. The number of Chinese nationals that were detrimentally affected by that is off the charts. And I think there is work that can be done. But it will have to be done potentially on a case-by-case basis or on a narrow basis moving forwards to build that intelligence sharing capability, and also to overcome some of the cultural and technical barriers that exist.
Thank you for that. So maybe thinking about from the policy side to kind of operational side, I mean, Adrian, is there anything you can say about experience of kind of collaboration on this or kind of related type economic crime cases with China during your time in the NEC?
Yeah, I mean, there are constraints on what I can say,
of
but
course,
as Catherine's picked up on, certainly when we're working on cases where there's an asset recovery angle and returning funds to China and to Chinese victims, understandably the Chinese are sort of quite willing to engage on those sorts of cases. But there have been positive conversations, and in many ways what I'm hoping is that that dialogue on that sort of casework can open up, improved dialogue to enable a degree of more proactive engagement on operational work. Now, the reality is that is still going to remain very difficult to do for some very obvious reasons. We also, in particular, need to be very careful about how this may come across to the Chinese community in the UK. Separately, there have been concerns about activities targeting what Chinese government counterparts would call dissidents. There's been the issue of illegal police stations, etc. So we have to be very careful how engagement with Chinese counterparts would be viewed by the Chinese community in the UK, which may then put off engagement with law enforcement here. So there's a real sort of tricky balancing act that we're going to have to strike.
So there's actually a question just picking up on that, which is, how when you think about law enforcement, or indeed in your community, Phil, where you have constituents, I mean, do we reach out to particular people in the community, in the Chinese community in the UK, to sort of try and use them as ambassadors? I mean, how, just at that level, how would one go about doing this?
I mean, there are some examples actually of this happening. So there's something called the Lantern Project, which has been driven out of the southwest. And it's a charitable thing, but it's engaging with the Chinese community, warning them about things like scams linked to actually potentially being a Chinese official engaging them. So there is outreach going on, and again, those sorts of things can over time build trust. So it's not impossible. It's just challenging.
Phil, there's a question. Do you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to echo the point that Adrian made about the kind of warning sign, though I certainly spoke to a number of people during the course of the paper who had stories about, attempted law enforcement engagement with the Chinese community, and they would have a conversation with somebody, and that person would then refuse to take their calls, refuse to speak to them again, say they were concerned about their family in China, they'd had threats. So just echo I think the really careful way this needs to be managed with the Chinese diaspora.
So Phil, there's a question here picking up on, you were talking about your attempts to kind of get legislation passed to kind of use funds that have been seized for sort of investment and so on. So can you talk a bit more about that? Someone here obviously wants to kind of go and support your lobbying efforts on that. Who's blocking it and why?
Well, I'm doing some lobbying. So there's an amendment down to the crime and policing bill to ask the government to conduct a consultation on the current Asset Recovery Incentive Scheme, ARIS, which does provide law enforcement with the proceeds of criminal activity to support the work they do, but looking at some of the annularity rules, it's quite technical, but about when you come to the end of the financial year, the extent to which some agencies are required to, where they're not able to use those funds, return them to the Treasury, but also to look at the percentage of assets that are seized that are then able to be repurposed. I think this is quite topical in a way, because I don't know if anyone saw, but the Cheshire Crime and Policing Commissioner, Dan Price, was talking about this on BBC Breakfast over the weekend. He was talking about it in a slightly different context, which was actually using monies to support children and young people in tackling antisocial behaviour. But it's something that I think has real resonance in communities and constituencies up and down the country, creating a demonstrable link between tackling organised and economic crime and then, on the other hand, using the seized proceeds of that to improve communities in local areas.
Thank you. Catherine, there's a question here. Obviously, a lot of what we've talked about is retail banking focused. Any perspective, have you got any perspective on kind of more institutional level banking? There are also some questions about, is this kind of CMLO activity supporting trade-based money laundering and that sort of stuff? So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, trade-based money laundering is a sort of a massive component of the broader ecosystem. I focused on the sort of underground banking, IVTS element of it today, in particular in the report. But yeah, the nexus with trade-based money laundering is absolutely significant, and we've seen, Adrian touched on it, but the real involvement of these Chinese networks, and a lot of the really big money that's moving is related to trade-based money laundering schemes. And I would suggest that trade-based money laundering, I think Adrian's already made this point, so I'm sort of echoing it, but it's not been something that many countries have dealt with particularly well, or we've got a handle on. I think the extent of trade-based money laundering more generally is probably underestimated in terms of the scale and the impact of it. It's been very difficult to get any kind of reliable estimate, but I know many people think it is the most significant way in which illicit funds move around the world. And these Chinese money laundering organizations certainly exploit the weaknesses from that perspective and are real big drivers of trade-based money laundering activity. I talk a little bit about this in the paper, but also the difficulty of trying to bucket things up into these acronyms that we love in the financial crime world is an IVTS or TBML, and actually, the activity of these organizations these CMLOs, to add another acronym to it, defy that neat categorization between, this is IVTS and this is this and this is TBML. Actually, their activities run across the range of that, and I think that also presents some difficulties, particularly when we're talking about some of the kind of public-private partnership type work, which focuses quite heavily on the sort of retail banking element of it, and potentially leaving other parts of the financial sector less engaged in that, when actually there are gaps there that are being exploited and more that they could be doing.
Excellent. Now, I like to prioritise people who put their name to questions, so I'm going to read out a question from Andrew Mackay. I like it when one of our associate fellows points the finger at another of our associate fellows, Adrian. So here we go. You get an intra-team shootout. CMLOs have scaled, commercialised and industrialised their activities. The delta is growing. How do we scale and industrialise the response? What can we do to, if not get ahead of, then really ramp up our efforts? Technology?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think there's two core things we need to do and are starting to do. So the first is really ramp up our international partnership sort of work operationally against this threat. So this is as again Catherine was talking about, this is a threat which is faced by many of our sort of key partners. So there is more we can do working with the Americans, working with the Canadians, Australians, etc. Also, there are key partners, for example, in Singapore, who are very impacted by this threat, and we're doing a lot of work with them. My team managed to not let me go to Singapore, but many of them have been to Singapore recently to develop our partnership with them. So operationally, there's a lot more we can do with key partners, but we also need to, reflecting in on Catherine's commentary, we need to work better with the private sector. So, as I touched on the system prioritisation piece, we have called out China as one of those areas where we want to work with counterparts in the private sector more effectively. And that is the retail banks primarily, but it's going to go well beyond that. And then I suppose segueing into technology as an enabler of those two, yes, there are things that we and the private sector need to do using, first to mention it tonight, AI. There's a lot more we can do with data sharing and exploitation of data on a global scale to get after the threat in a way we haven't been able to thus far.
And just staying with you for a second, there's another question here. Obviously, when the NCA and the NEC mount disruption activity like Operation Destabilise, there is clearly a displacement. You talked about the way in which it happens. So how, in law enforcement, how do you think about the impact of your impact on sort of future work you need to do? What sort of thinking do you do to sort of try and prophesize, what is going to be the consequence of the action you take, and try and position yourselves to deal with that? Or is that me just being too simplistic?
I think the reality is we do it sometimes we don't. So sometimes you just take the advantage of the operational situation in front of your face and go after it. But where we can, we do try and think more strategically. And with Destabilise, we were already aware when we were taking the operational action against the targets, we knew where they would probably start to move, and so there is ongoing work against where we know they've likely moved to. So I say it's sometimes we think ahead, sometimes we don't, but when we can, we do. Okay.
Catherine, there's a question from you here. People keep voting, and so they're like racing around on the screen. I can't keep up. Here we go. What, at the end of all this, what would you, in a year's time, 2 years' time, what would you like the impact of the paper to have been? What are the recommendations that you feel could be taken forward now? What are the recommendations that we're going to need to work on, but at least set ourselves a target of working on those in light of the research?
I I feel like maybe that question came from somebody in the Sockcase team.
Well, it's anonymous.
Having had that discussion
It's anonymous.
with them.
It's one of those Chinese people that's discovered our website.
To be honest, I mean, and we actually have discussed this with Heather and Lindsay and the team at Sockcase, and actually, kind of Phil's already mentioned what would be the ultimate impact, which is getting China to move away from the capital flight restrictions and ease the capital controls. Because if you did that, then you cut off what is so profitable about Chinese money laundering organizations and why they're so successful. I think maybe that's a slightly lofty, ambitious goal, but it's down there as a potential impact. I think for me, the core thing really, and it touches on, I think, what's been covered by the other panelists, is around this idea of collaboration and coordination and using opportunities, whether it's the Illicit Finance Summit, whether it's other opportunities, to better share the information, intelligence about the threat, given the way that we know that these organizations are operating globally and transnationally, that there is a huge role there for a better sharing of intelligence. So I think for me that point on collaboration is key. I would also point to the fact that earlier this year, the Chancellor announced that there would be, I will get the name wrong, but I think it's a financial crime or illicit finance working group as part of the UK kind of China diplomatic dialogue. And I think being able to surface these issues and actually make real tangible progress. And there was a similar sort of illicit finance dialogue set up under the Biden administration between the US and China, and I'm not sure how much progress they made. The readout of those meetings generally said things like, we had a meeting, matters were discussed. So whether there was, how much tangible progress was made, I'm not sure. But I think there are a number of different routes and avenues to improve that collaboration. I think that's what I would really like to see. If there is, I think any evidence of kind of Chinese authorities publicly kind of taking this threat more seriously and collaborating with authorities in the West, I think that to me would be a fantastic impact.
So actually I was going to ask, and you've slightly preempted the question, and it's also here as well, but the UK has, for example, an illicit finance, anti-illicit finance, whatever it's called, partnership with the UAE, for example. So I was just kind of wondering, is that the kind of thing that one could imagine being set up and actually being active? Phil, you name-checked the Illicit Finance Summit upcoming. Shall we aim for that as an outcome of the summit? Can you imagine something like that working?
Well, I think we should be aiming for the skies. I mean, certainly, this is going to be a landmark opportunity for the UK government to convene countries that have a shared interest. We know from the research Catherine's done that invariably there is a Chinese leg to a lot of the washing of criminal proceeds, and there's a clear opportunity to put something more concrete in place that allows these issues to continue to be surfaced and raised, but also I think presents UK government with an opportunity to flag and raise awareness within the diaspora community here in the UK.
Okay, I realise I meant to ask a question earlier on. I'm going to ask it now because we've mentioned AI twice, but we haven't actually mentioned cryptocurrency once. And this whole conversation has been quite old-fashioned. In other words, it's been about cash. It's been about flying money, which is old as the hills as a concept. So maybe Adrian, a last question to you. How should we be thinking about how might crypto play a role in these kinds of schemes going forward? Again, maybe it doesn't now, but how would you anticipate that it might start to be used? Give some tips to our Chinese viewers. I don't think they need the tips, they know already. The reality is crypto can enable value to move across borders at pace and very cheaply. But crypto does also, and the blockchain, give opportunities to law enforcement. And it's something that I bang on about quite a lot, which is actually fiat currency is really hard to sort of track and trace, whereas through the blockchain you can track and trace a lot of the crypto activity. I've got to be slightly careful here because one of the companies I'm now advising is a blockchain. I'm not allowed to mention it. Blockchain analytics company. But there are capabilities now that law enforcement globally are able to utilise, which you can't do these things with fiat currency. So it's both an opportunity and a threat, as many of these technologies are. So, Catherine, I'm going to give the very last question to you, and then you feel free to say a few words to conclude. But it's a great question. And because it comes from coast, it's going to be a difficult one as well. I hear the FATF is considering doing some work on this issue. What might be some of the hurdles there, considering China would probably have to be on board?
I think asked and answered in the question. I think the FATF did do work on professional money laundering, I think back in 2018. They published a report on professional money laundering. They've obviously they've done other reports on, I will never get the acronym right, something like Hawala and other similar service providers, or some catchy acronym. Somebody's nodding at the back.
Yes, HOSPs.
So I think, from my perspective, from a FATF perspective, it feels like it's ripe to revisit, some of the thematic work on professional money laundering. It's, a little bit out of date, but I do say that about quite a lot of topics. I think the FATF should look at, again, cash being an obvious example. But yeah, I mean, the question said it as well. China is a member of FATF. The way that the FATF system works allows countries, the kind of right of veto over certain things. Chinese, underground banking and shadow banking in China is clearly a risk. From a Chinese perspective, you look at the last China's national risk assessment, it talks about the risk, and from an underground banking perspective, from a China perspective. Also worth flagging that China will be shortly undergoing its mutual evaluation as well, which will kind of factor into it. So there's a lot of elements at play here. I would really like to see, I guess, FATF do more work on the kind of professional money laundering topic more generally. I think from when, in the last 5 years, I think the complexity and the severity of and the way in which the sophistication of these networks, I think, has changed a lot, that I think it can revisit that without necessarily, picking out China. But I totally appreciate that every decision the FATF makes is mired in the politics of the institution.
Well, perhaps a future president of the FATF with illicit finance at his heart might be interested in picking that up. So our time is up. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. I tried my best to cover as many of them as we can. We will have drinks upstairs in a second, so you can, of course, ask those questions one-on-one to our panelists when you go upstairs. And so, what I need to do is say, Adrian, thank you very much indeed for your contribution, sharing your experience. Phil, thank you very much for your remarks, what you do in Parliament, and we're here to help always. And Catherine, congratulations, fantastic paper, and a round of applause, please.